Absolutely. Thank you very much, Josh. And let me see. So this is the second time we have had Chris Kuehl visit us, and he's from Kansas City, and I'm very excited that he's here with us. If any of you remember him from last time, we had him here in August, and it was very well attended and very interesting. And so let me tell you a little bit about him. Chris is Managing Director of Armada Corporate Intelligence, and he's one of the co-founders of the company. He's been with Armada's Economic Analyst and has worked with a variety of private clients and professional associations in the last 18 years. He's the Chief Economist for the National Association for Credit Management, and he also prepares the association's monthly Credit Managers Index. He's also the Economic Analyst for the Fabricators and Manufacturers Association and writes their biweekly publication, Fabrinomics, which details the impact of the economic trends on manufacturers. He's the chief editor for the Business Intelligence Brief. He's distributed all over the world by business organizations and one of the primary writers of the Black Owl Report. He also makes about 100 presentations each year to today, us and another group, to many business and industry associations all across the US and overseas. I think you were with the Wisconsin Bankers Association today, if I'm correct, Chris.
Yep, that's true.
Absolutely. And he has a doctorate of political economics and advanced degrees in Soviet studies, Asian studies. He was a professor of international economics and finance for over 15 years before starting with Armada. And I will tell you that this will be a fun presentation because on top of being just excellent and having everything at the tip of his hands, he's also pretty funny. So this will be a great time.
Very good.
I'll turn it over to you. It's all yours, Chris.
All right, thanks very much. Yes, I was speaking to the Wisconsin bankers. This seems to be Bankers Week. I was speaking to the Iowa bankers on Wednesday, and I think I've got Texas bankers next week. So what can I say? I'm an economist that talks to accountants and bankers, and if that isn't exciting, I don't know what is. So you're very patient to be doing this on a Friday afternoon. I mean, most people would be starting at least their first round of cocktails by now, but here you are listening to an economist. It could be worse. You could have been the Wisconsin bankers and have started your day with an economist, but at least it gets worked in. I wanted to start by simplifying everything for you. So I put it all in one graph. That way you just have to look at one thing and know what's happening in the economy now and in the future. And I'm done now, so we can all go drink. No, that's not true. It's also interesting. I ran across this cartoon and I thought that's perfect. You know, the pigeons are attracted to the COOs because it just seems natural. So I couldn't resist. I'm going to start with my bold predictions for 2022 on the assumption that by the time this is over, you will have forgotten them and will not bring them up later when they're all incorrect. My favorite definition of an economist is someone who explains tomorrow why the predictions they made yesterday didn't come true today. We are eternally grateful for meteorologists because they make us look good. Right now, a lot of the predictions for the coming year are changing. You know, there's an awful lot of assumptions built into all of these. And the assumptions that we were making at the end of last year are turning out not to be as accurate as we hoped they would be as we get into 2022. Not all of them have changed, but some of them have. We're probably looking at growth getting back to normal levels, not completely back. We were at about 2.5% per year for the last 25 years. That's been our average. And obviously we've had some years where it's been stronger and some years where it's been much weaker. But over that 20-year period, we averaged about 2.5. So we're going to be on the high side of that average. We're going to be somewhere around 3.5, maybe 4. Mostly towards the end of the year. I think we're going to start off a little bit slower than we anticipated, but things begin to pick up as the year progresses, assuming some of the things that we think are going to happen actually do. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. Obviously, the number one topic for everybody for the last several weeks has been inflation. The numbers came out again today. The consumer price index at 7.5, which set the media into a frenzy, as it always does. A couple of things just to kind of, I don't know, calm the waters a bit. The consumer price index is not really the most accurate way of measuring inflation. It's simple and it comes out in a timely way, but the weakness of the CPI is that there's a certain amount of mythical part to it. The way they compute this is they've created a typical basket of goods, which the typical consumer purchases in the course of a month. So they look at the prices last month, they look at the prices this month, and that tells them what inflation is. The challenge is that right now we're dealing with four very different cohorts as far as spending is concerned. Boomers don't spend like Gen Xers. Gen Xers don't spend like millennials. Millennials don't spend like Gen Z. So whose basket are we looking at? Is it a boomer basket? Is it a Gen Z basket? There's a lot of difference in those pricings as we look at these different collections. But its advantage is that it's current. It comes out every month. The Fed does not really pay much attention to the CPI. The measurement that they're more interested in is PCE, the personal consumption expenditures number. PCE is more accurate, but it's also slower. You've got to let things actually happen, because what you're doing is calculating what people actually spent their money on compared to the month before. So PCE numbers are always going to lag. So it may be that inflation is worse than we think according to PCE. It just, you have to take that into consideration. But when you're looking for the Fed to act, they're not going to react to the CPI, and they're not going to react to the PPI. They don't pay attention to either one of those. The inflation rate is expected to start falling in the next quarter or two. There was an anticipation that it would be falling by now, but that hasn't turned out to be the case for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about in a minute. But by the end of the year, we should be close to maybe 4%, 3.5% to 4% at the core, and maybe around 5 to 6% at the real rate. Both of those are higher than we have been in recent years. I mean, generally, the Fed would like to see the core rate somewhere around 2.5%. The difference, and you've all dealt with this for years, core rate is the rate of inflation without food and fuel. The reason we don't count food and fuel is that it messes up our models when we do. And as economists, we hate that. We want to be able to compare year over year. So including those volatile prices makes it hard to do that. So we don't count them. You, on the other hand, are counting them because you're paying those prices. Those are the real rates. This, of course, is going to cause interest rates to rise. But again, in all the excitement today, there were predictions that, oh my God, the Fed is going to raise rates 7, 8, 10, 20, 80 times. The interest rate is going to be 700% by next Thursday. It's like, no, it's not. The Fed only has control over one thing when it comes to inflation. The only thing they can influence is monetary. They can control the amount of money to a degree that's circulating in society. But what's driving inflation right now is not money supply. It's the commodities costs that have gone up steadily, and it's the wage costs that are going up steadily. And really, it's the supply chain that has been driving a lot of that inflationary activity. The Fed has not much control over that. So the Fed is continuing to talk about 3 hikes starting in March, probably getting rates to between 0.75 and 1.5 by the end of the year, depending on whether or not they do a 1/4 point increase per meeting or a 1/2 point increase. That's their stated goal. Now, understand that the Fed right now is a very transparent Fed. This is not Alan Greenspan territory. Greenspan told nobody anything about anything. Remember Squawk Box, who used to try to measure his briefcase to figure out what he was going to do? Well, we've had the Bernanke, Yellen, Powell Fed, and this is a very open, call your shots, don't surprise anybody Fed. We will know if the Fed is shifting from that 3 rates starting in March well in advance. They're not going to spring it on anybody. It's one of those things, they'll start talking it up relatively soon if they're going to do it. The one thing to be aware of that could throw a little bit of a wrinkle into this is that the group that makes the decision is the Open Market Committee. The Open Market Committee is made up of the Board of Governors plus 4 regional Fed presidents. These 4 have an awful lot of influence because they're sort of the eyes and ears of the Fed. That rotates every year. There's a different 4 every year. Last year, the 4 were either doves when it came to rates or at least neutral. This year, you've got two of the most hawkish members of the Fed on that open market committee. You have Esther George from my very own Kansas City, and you have Loretta Mester from Cleveland. Esther George is this charming middle-aged woman until the subject of inflation comes up, and then she sounds like something out of The Exorcist. I mean, she really does not like inflation, and she has been trying to push rates up for years for all kinds of reasons. She doesn't like what it's done to savings. She doesn't like what it's done to the stock market because people can go out and borrow money very cheaply, play the market, make money, pay the loan back. She worries about that and says, well, what happens if the market corrects once you have borrowed millions of dollars and you can't pay the loan back to the bank? Now the bank's in trouble. So she's been an advocate for higher rates, as has Loretta Mester. Jim Bullard will also be on the open market committee. He kind of runs hot and cold, sometimes hawkish, sometimes dovish. He's the St. Louis Fed guy. And then you've got a new guy that will be coming in from the Boston Fed. It would have been Eric Rosengren, but he retired early and he was a hawk. Very likely that the person who replaces Rosengren will be a hawk because the group that makes that choice is local, regional to Boston, and they're a hawkish group. I throw that out just because if there is a question about whether to go half point, quarter point, 3 hikes, 4 hikes, that group is going to be pushing fairly hard for a little more aggressive position, not just because of inflation, but because they've not been big fans of low interest rates for years. So everything else goes up too, not hugely. We think mortgage rates are going to be between maybe 3.8, maybe 4.1, 4.5, still historically low, but not as low as they've had been. Unemployment has been a big issue. And again, it's been kind of ridiculously dealt with by the media. I understand that economics is fundamentally boring, but the media just tries desperately to make it interesting by threatening imminent death. It's kind of like, just stop it. Really, guys, it's just as boring as you think it is. Just leave it alone. So there's this notion that people don't want to work anymore. That's why we have a labor shortage. Well, that's kind of stupid because nobody wants to work. I mean, honestly, we want to live in San Diego and hang out on the beach. But we work because we have to. We have bills to pay. We have mortgages to pay. We have kids to send to school. So we work. What's happening is not that people aren't working, it's that they're working in different ways and they're finding other ways to make a living, particularly if they're in the lower income categories. And just one example of this, I was speaking to the Dry Cleaners Association not long ago, and one of the real threats they're running into is internet laundry. And so I asked, what is internet laundry? And they said, what it is people who take a look at what they would make if they took a minimum wage job, $15 an hour. That's going to net them about 120 bucks a day. If they simply put on the internet that they're willing to do other people's laundry with their washing machine and dryer, the average take home is 300 bucks. And if you're really honest, you'll tell the IRS, but most won't. And all of a sudden, all of this kind of gig economy stuff is exploding. We know it through rideshare. We know it through, Uber Eats, all this stuff. But it's everything. I mean, anything you can think of in the way of a personal service, you can post out on the internet and make a living off of it. And a lot of people are doing exactly that and sort of bugging out of those low paid jobs altogether. So it's a shift in kind of the way that we employ ourselves. A lot of the reason that we've had the workforce participation rate fall as low as it has is simply retirement. We've been seeing boomers hit retirement age at the rate of 10,000 a day for the last several years. Boomers being boomers, we didn't notice it at first because boomers were reluctant to retire and they kind of hung in there into their 60s and 70s. But it's one thing to be working into your late 60s and early 70s. It's another to keep doing it when you're in your mid to late 70s and 80s. And now the boomers really are retiring. And that's taking a big chunk out of the workforce. Then, because of COVID, we have about 7 million women who've not been able to get back into the workforce because of childcare and the inability to figure out what the schools are going to do from one week to the next. A few weeks back, you may remember that the Chicago Teachers Union declared that all the public schools were going to go virtual again, shutting down all the schools. That very day, 450,000 women quit their jobs. That day. What choice did they have? Juniors coming home. You're going to be teaching algebra at the kitchen table again, whether you like it or not. And until that gets worked out, you're going to have a lot of people that are essentially locked out of the workforce, at least for the time being. So those are some of the things that will be keeping an eye on as the year progresses. This is the conference board's take on where we're likely to be. So they look at things like the core PCE inflation rate. They see it dropping fairly consistently through the year, going closer to what the Fed would consider to be normal by the end of the year. They're a little optimistic, and they've even changed just a tad in the last couple of days regarding where they think inflation is going to be. But for the most part, they're expecting decent GDP growth, probably hitting a peak maybe second or third quarter before it slows. But even when it slows, it's still slightly higher than our 20-year average. One of the things that's important to note about inflation and the Fed's role is that personal savings have come back to normal. What was driving inflation last year was a whole lot of accumulated money. Going back to 2020, we had no idea what was going on. And if you remember what the conversation was back then, everyone was assuming this was going to be short term, that, a month or two may rebound, June at the latest. People weren't really being fired. They were just being furloughed. Don't worry about it. We'll just isolate for a couple of months and it'll be fine. Well, it didn't turn out that way. And as a result, you ended up with this huge stimulus pouring into the economy with no place to go. I mean, it's time-honored tradition that you deal with a recession by shoving money into the hands of the consumer, hope that they spend like a drunken sailor on leave and spend you right out of the recession. But how do you do that when everything you spend your money on has been closed? 65% of what we spend our money on is services. If you're in the upper 20% of income earners, 80% of your money is spent on services. You've already got all the things you want. Now you pay people to do things for you. You go on vacations, you go to concerts, you go out to expensive restaurants. None of that stuff was available as we were locking down in 2020. Our savings rate went from around 6% to 38%, and you can see how the spike went. Well, being consumers, we managed to blow through $5 to $6 trillion in a year. We spent our savings. We had a pretty good Christmas, and now we're seeing our personal savings rate back down to where it normally is, 7.9. We kind of average between 6 to 8% savings year over year. That money supply weight is now off the economy. So the Fed's number one focus is trying to dry up the money supply. That has happened. So the Fed doesn't really need to use interest rates to accomplish that goal. We've already done it. We've already sucked a lot of the money out of the economy as consumers, as businesses. So it's put more of the onus on other sectors as far as dealing with inflation. Graphically, this is what we went through in 21 and 20, and it was just predictable. Services died in 2020, came roaring back in 2021. We did a lot of buying of goods in 2020 because we had money, we might as well, and it began to tail off in 2021 as we went back to spending on services. This is the year they start to balance out again, and we start getting a pattern close to what we've had in previous years. One of the challenges with kind of getting the service sector back into gear was that it happened unexpectedly fast. We did not expect consumers to come roaring out of the gate in 2021. Most of the assessment was that, okay, we're beginning to loosen restrictions. It's not going to be a big deal. People are still going to stay cautious. They're still not going to do all these things. Well, that was wrong. We were like, what do you mean I can go out to eat again? I'm going to go out to eat 14 times a day because I can. I'm going to travel to places I don't even want to go to just because I can travel. It's just, we went nuts. We were growing in the second quarter of last year at a 9.6% rate. It eventually slowed down to 6.5. But when you think that our normal rate is 2.5 and we were growing at 6.5, that's ridiculous. And a lot of the inflation we're dealing with now stems from that. We overwhelmed the producers, we overwhelmed the supply chain, we overwhelmed the ability to keep up on the labor side of things. We just simply overwhelmed the economy. Many companies have gone into almost hibernation in 2020 because they didn't know how long this was going to last. I mean, this wasn't one of those normal recessions where you could figure out when the end game was going to be. I mean, you were being told in 2020, well, this could last decades. We could be dealing with COVID for the next century. And you would ask people, when do you think things will reopen? Oh, I don't know. I mean, I went back and looked. Some of the CDC people with a perfectly straight face were saying things will not return to normal until 2050 or 2060. If you're a business, what does that tell you? It tells you to shut the doors and go home. It's never coming back. It's over. Over time, we began to say, okay, maybe we're being a little hysterical and things will become a little less dramatic. But for a while, we were completely and utterly freaked out. Corporate spending has been pretty strong. We have seen a pretty considerable amount of investment coming out of the corporate community. A little bit of a danger here. If you look at the Q4 numbers, we saw a lot more inventory accumulation, which is a natural response both to anticipated inflation and to the supply chain. If you think prices are going to go up, well, you're obviously going to buy what you can now. If you've been upset by the supply chain and you finally do get access to what it is you need, you're going to tend to buy more than you need. And we've been watching really aggressive inventory accumulation. It was mentioned in the introduction, I do work for the National Association for Credit Management. The credit managers were all reporting that, wow, people are asking for a lot more credit than they used to because they're just loading up. If they can get a hold of something, they're buying it. The danger is that 3, 4, 5, 6 months down the road, you've got all this inventory, which you've not been able to sell, which means you're not going to buy anything new. And you're going to try to get rid of that inventory because now it's sitting on your books. One of the predictions around inflation is that when companies hit that point, that's when you start to see fire sales where people are like, oh, okay, we bought 40 million of these and we've only been able to sell 11. So we need to get rid of the other 39,900,000 of these. So we're selling them for like, I don't know, $1. Just get them out of our warehouse. We don't have a need for this. It's not a universal response, but companies they've been gun shy. They've been hurt by the supply chain, and it's gone on month after month after month. We'll talk a little bit about some other responses to that. So inflation, inflation, inflation. We're hitting peaks that we've not seen in a long time. We're back to where we saw them in 82. But obviously, in previous decades, we've seen much higher inflation. Inflation tends to be transitory at some levels and not so transitory at others. Commodities inflation goes up and down. It's very demand and supply driven. Right now, we're dealing, and I'll talk more about it when we talk about oil, we're dealing with some geopolitical issues that are driving up commodity prices higher than they normally would be. The one we're worried about is wages. Once wages go up, they don't come down. And it's the potential of that wage price spiral where the wages go up and the producers raise their prices to keep up with the wages, which require the wage earners to request more money so they can pay those higher prices. And then the prices go up and then the wages go up and then the prices, it just never quits because people are trying to stay ahead of that curve. I mean, right now, the average wage increase has been around 5 to 6% nationwide, but inflation's 7.5. So these wage increases are not yet keeping up with inflation. But at some point, when inflation begins to drop again, now the wages will be higher than inflation and we'll have a whole different problem to deal with. So here's the projection, and this is looking at CPI numbers. By the time we get to the end of this year, the inflation rate will have dropped back to what we saw probably 2019, 2018, a little bit higher than that, certainly not back to what it was in 2020, but back to levels that would be considered semi-normal, back to 2018, 2019 levels. That's dependent on a lot of things. It's dependent on the commodities being as transitory as we thought, and it depends on the wage situation not getting measurably bad. And there are some things that will control wages. Part of the reason we've seen a lot of inflation on the wage side is we don't do as much globalization as we used to. And those of you who are doing international have been watching this for years. That was the way that we exported inflation, 10, 20 years ago. If people were asking for more money, well, relocate, do your production in China. If production costs are going up, relocate, do your production in China, do it in Mexico, do it somewhere else. The supply chain crisis has forced a lot of business back to the United States. That and the fact that production costs have gone up overseas and the capability of outsourcing your inflation has diminished. And so one of the reasons that we've seen inflation is that the globalization piece is beginning to fade a little bit, and companies are looking at other factors. They still like the lower production costs, but now they're worried about the supply chain cost eating into whatever profits they made by outsourcing. So you're in this bit of a transition zone, but that's part of the reason that we expect inflation to start diminishing. If we do get a 1.5 hike, which would be starting it in March and raising the rates by a 0.5 point each time, it's still going to be at the lower end of the spectrum. I mean, in very recent memory, we had much higher interest rates. And obviously, we had growth. I mean, if you look at where the interest rates were prior to the 2008 recession, yeah, we weren't having any problem with growth back then. I mean, we were surging along quite nicely with 5, 6% interest rates. So an interest rate hike of 1.5, 2, 2.5 isn't going to shut down growth. It is going to start limiting a certain amount of investment behavior. But as mentioned in the beginning, I've been talking to bankers a lot, and the bankers are all pointing out that there's a silver lining to this. We are, as bankers, now going to be able to make loans that we were not able to make before. When we had no margin, we had to be super careful as far as who we loaned money to because there was no float, there was no protection. With some interest rate flexibility, now they can start being a little less risk averse. And every banking group that I've talked to, all the bankers are saying, oh yeah, we thoroughly expect to be doing more loans to companies that have had some blemishes. I mean, we've had the same challenge this time as we had back in 2008, 2009. The regulators came in and said, okay, you can't loan to people who have financial distress. And in 2008 and 9, we're like, is there a company on the planet that has not had financial distress? We just went through a recession. And the regulators are doing it again now. They're saying, well, if companies had a problem in 2020, hello, are you familiar at all with this COVID thing? You do understand that it shut down the entire freaking global economy for a year. Show me a company that wasn't affected by that. And frankly, actually, I can. I'm not supposed to spread this around, but at the end of March, I'm speaking to the Casket and Funeral Supply Association, and they asked me not to really mention that they had a really good year in 2020. So, the old Scottish proverb, it's an ill wind that blows nobody good, somebody benefits. I also gave a talk to the Georgia Watermelon Association. So I'm just pointing out that they have a watermelon queen. And I think it's probably time that the COO Forum had a queen, but that's just me. That it just was fun. To be the watermelon queen, by the way, you have to compete in a watermelon seed spitting contest. And the girl that won, 9 feet, 9 feet, she spit that seed. So, I mean, that woman's been practicing. So job openings, back to seriousness here. We have about 11 million jobs that are available, about 6 million people ostensibly in the position of seeking those jobs. The problem is, and has been for 5, 6, 10 years, most of those open jobs require skills that the unemployed don't have. So whether it's manufacturers, construction, transportation, there's a demand for talents that are not generally available. I could go on for days ranting about how miserably our educational system matches up with the needs of business. But I'll suffice it to say that last year we graduated 10,000 people with advanced degrees in film criticism. We can't find truck drivers. We can't find people who can run machines. We can't find construction workers. But if you need a film critic, they're out there. They're probably all working at Starbucks as a barista, but they're ready. One of the indicators that I know you pay a lot of attention to because it's very reliable and it's just accurate, is the Purchasing Managers Index. The joy of the PMI is basically three things. One, it's current, comes out every month. Two, it's accurate because purchasing managers don't know enough to lie. If you ask a purchasing manager what they're doing, are you buying more or less steel? More. How come? I don't know. I don't even know what we make. They told me to buy more steel. We're out of toilet paper. I'm the purchasing manager, man. I just buy stuff that people tell me to buy. I don't know why. I don't care why. That's not my job. So they answer the questions accurately, more, less, or the same. And it also is an easy to understand index because anything over 50 indicates growth, anything under 50 is contraction. And we've been in growth territory for well over a decade. Even though we've seen a bit of a decline in the last couple of months, it came off of a really high end of 2021 where we were up in the 60s. Now we're in the 50s, high 50s, which is still very, very strong. Purchasing managers are buying stuff, and that's a good indication. What's even a better indication is there's a sub-index of this called the New Orders Index, and this means new customers, new orders coming in for these products. That's been even higher. Those have been in the 60s consistently. So if you're looking for kind of a quick way to keep score without all the noise that's coming out of the press these days, just take a look at the PMI numbers. There's two groups that do PMIs. This one, Market, is affiliated with IHS. It's a British marketing firm that tied up with an economic group. They do the PMI for like 38 different countries. So you can compare the US to Germany and China and Japan. Then there's the Institute for Supply Management, which is just the United States. They tend to poll a little bit smaller companies. So the ISM index often is a little bit less dramatic than Market, but not by much. The ISM's numbers are in the 50s as well. So we're looking at some point to get back to that little orange box where inventory to sales ratios are normal. We had way too much inventory when everything shut down. We had way too little as the producers were not producing. Now we're slowly crawling our way back into that box, which is where you want to be, where inventory and sales match up. That's another indicator that kind of lets you know where the economy is as a whole. One of the reasons that we've been a little bit slow in some sectors is that we're not yet going back to work in the traditional way. Only about 40% of us are still going back to the office. 60% are still in a virtual environment, at least part of the time. A lot of this is sector driven. I speak a lot to accountants, as I mentioned. Accountants, they don't care. They love remote. They don't want to be around people anyway. If they had personalities, they wouldn't be accountants, so they're all like, yay, I can stay home all day. Salespeople are going absolutely insane. They cannot do this. And the groups that I've been speaking to, the ones that are back to their full numbers, salespeople, and it's just like, guys, we have got to get back out on the road. We can't do what we do on Zoom calls and text messages. We've seen some conversation about higher and higher oil prices. There are some that are talking about $100 a barrel. That's kind of a minority position still. Most are thinking it's going to peak around the high 80s, maybe low 90s, and then fall back down to the 60s and 70s. The wild card when it comes to oil is that geopolitical thing I mentioned earlier. A big reason for this discussion around oil has been the mess in Europe. The Russians are blackmailing Europe, or trying to. They want the Europeans to pay for and authorize Nord Stream 2, which is a second gas pipeline coming out of Russia. They want Europe to back off on Ukraine. In order to get them to do that, because the Europeans don't want to do either one of those things, you've got Putin saying, don't give me what I want, you get no gas. And gas prices have risen in Europe by 600%. Which has forced the Europeans into the market to buy whatever LNG they can get their hands on, which has driven that price up, which has forced the US utilities to start burning oil, because even with higher prices, it's cheaper than LNG. So there's been this cascade of events. The oil producers look at this and say, okay, we see the demand right now, but we also see that this whole crisis could end in an hour. If Putin backs off, or more likely the Germans back off and cave and say, fine, whatever, we'll pay for the pipeline. We don't care about Ukraine. It's not part of Germany. Just give us our gas. The crisis ends, price of gas falls, and all that extra production they would have been doing would be unneeded. They look at that daily commute. They're looking at that 60% of us still working remotely. And they're saying, until you start hitting the highways like you used to, with your 30-mile commute each way for half an hour each way, you're not consuming fuel. And if you're not consuming fuel like you used to, we're not going to produce like we used to, because there'd be no point. So the oil companies are kind of sitting back, waiting for that normal consumption to start. And the way that a lot of analysts are looking at this is that there's going to be a shortage of oil until spring. And then all of a sudden, the producers are saying, okay, it's spring. We're recovering from all the COVID stuff. People are going to travel again. The weather is nice. Vacations are going to start. Even today, there was some reaction in the oil markets to the comments that Fauci made yesterday or the day before, where he got up in front of God and everybody and said, the pandemic peak is over. We're going to get to a point now where it's going to be an individual decision and the mandates are going to drop. New York is talking about dropping them, and Massachusetts and Connecticut, and they were among the strictest in the country. And I can tell you, traveling around the country, the mask mandate has vanished. I mean, it's rare when you see. I was at the Wisconsin Dells yesterday, today, whatever. I didn't see a mask the whole time I was there. I mean, it's like not the staff, not the people. It's like we're done. And if that becomes the common response, then all of a sudden the expectation is that we'll start driving again, start going back to work again, etc. So that's kind of the thing to watch. Everybody is waiting for that shoe to drop. Meanwhile, diesel prices are affecting freight movement because you're seeing a lot of transportation and logistics costs going up. That's one of the things that's been driving inflation, but it's also one that is likely to start reversing sooner than later. Transportation is very, very sensitive to demand. Part of what's driving all of the congestion is all that stuff that was coming into the ports late finally showed up, and it's being distributed. So it's now making its way into the system, much to the dismay of the retailers, because they're like, what exactly am I supposed to do with Christmas 2021? You know, it's over. I can't paint it red and call it Valentine's Day. You know, it's like, what am I going to do with all this junk? So that's another reason for potential fire sales. Our transportation demand index, this is something Armada put together a number of years back for a client, is showing that demand is still rising, but it's not where it was even back in 11 and 13. So the demand is very strong right now, but it's not even
I really appreciate it.
as strong as it has been in previous years. pricing at the spot market is ridiculous. We have like 11 loads for every truck on the road. Much of that is due to driver shortage, and that's another kind of wild card where we don't quite know how long that lasts. Many of the shortage situations can be traced back to regulatory changes and all sorts of stuff. Like, we talk a lot about the congestion on the California ports. Part of the reason for that congestion is the regulatory impact on the ports. You cannot drive into California ports if your truck is too old. If it is older than from 2015, it's not allowed because of air pollution. If the drivers have tested positive for marijuana in the last 3 weeks, they can't drive. They lose their CDL. I mean, if you're not a union driver, you can't go into certain parts of the ports because the longshore union prohibits it. It's difficult for the trucking industry to service the ports, and that has added to the driver shortage situation. The new regulations on hours of service, it seems very logical, but it's very rigid. So you've got a situation where you're supposed to drive for 10 and a half hours maximum, no matter how close you are to home. And you've got drivers who are saying, I'm 30 minutes from home. Too bad, you've got to park the truck right there and wait for your next shift. Literally, I mean, it has been reported that one of the biggest demand for Uber has been truck drivers that have had to park their truck and Uber to get home, and then will come back the next day and pick up the truck. So, I mean, it makes sense to limit the number of hours. You don't want tired drivers, but some flexibility would be useful. I could go on for days. We have transportation clients, and they complain about this to me all the time. We have seen the pricing elevated in everything. Truckload, less than truck, rail, all of them are seeing price increases. And kind of finishing off, and then I'll shut up so we can take questions. The thing that also may play a big role in driving growth and affecting inflation is that the infrastructure money starts to come out about mid-year. This was fairly aggressively front-loaded. The idea was to get as much of this involved with the shortest period of time. So a lot of it's going to be spent in the first year or two. A lot of it's going to be coming out yet this year. Most of that will be traditional. It's going to be port infrastructure, roads, bridges, that kind of thing. But there are some kind of mystery projects in there that nobody's quite sure yet what that means. I mean, there's 10 billion, 16 billion for special projects, and no one has a clue what those are. So there's money for water infrastructure and so on. That will start making an impact on the economy sooner than later, because it will certainly increase activity on the construction side. Construction is kind of coming back, but it's by and large focused on warehouse and logistics. Amazon is now responsible for 1/3 of all the warehouse development in the entire United States. So it is dramatically changing the footprint, and there's all kinds of strange things on the horizon. Canadian Pacific is buying Kansas City Southern with the express desire to shift freight from the West Coast to the middle of the United States. They want to take as much as 40% of that freight and shift it coming in through the port of Vancouver, Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico, rail to the middle of the US. The estimate is between 800,000 and 1.5 million additional containers a week coming into the middle of the country. And that turns I-35 into the warehouse corridor of the next millennium. So I live in Kansas City. You turn your back on your garage, Amazon buys it, and makes a distribution center out of it. It's been pretty nuts. So with that, I saw this coffee cup and I thought you all should get one. You should be basically issued one by the forum. Being a chief operating officer is easy as riding a bike. So if the bike is on fire, you're on fire, everything is on fire, and you're in hell. So my experience has been, when you're looking for somebody to blame, every corporate client we've ever had, we've ended up working with the CEO, COO, because when all else fails, all the other C levels just blame it on you, and say, I don't know what the hell's going on. talk to the chief operating officer. So it's, as a friend of mine in the military said, you know, to be honest, the chief operating officer is essentially the master sergeant of the business world. The officers have no idea what to do, so they throw it to the sergeant. So any questions before I let you go on about your business?
Great presentation. We'll start calling on some folks. I know I have a couple of questions, but I want to give others a chance to jump in. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, actually, I got two things. One is one is a suggestion for you. The Fed's coined the term transitory inflation, so you might just use transitory predictions. I throw that out at you.
Well, it's not a Fed invention. Transitory has been around for a long time, and it's usually used to refer to prices that are volatile, that they know that they come up and they come down. The only truly transitory bank right now, the only one that is still really sticking to their guns, is the Reserve Bank of Australia. They still insist that all of this is transitory and it'll go away in another quarter. Everybody else is saying, yeah, parts of it are transitory, but we're not as convinced as we were 2 months ago.
Yeah. Well, so here's my real question, and it really has to do with, it seems that I'll call it, well, I'll call it the science of economics is sort of influenced a lot by the politics and policy. So I look at this, so I look at, you talked about the energy. A lot of what you say, the free market doesn't necessarily work well in California because we're down to 2 refineries. We use a special formulation, so we're not open to the full market. But so how are you sort of factoring that in your analysis? And then the other one is, are we starting to look at carbon costs? Like you talked about reshoring, there's also, as we go into the ESG and carbon more and more becomes a factor, are there data studies, or they're starting to formulate some of that into economic forecasts and predictions?
Yeah, I mean, economics and politics are joined at the hip. And the problem, of course, is that economists are basically trying to collect data and trying to be accurate about what it is they're looking at. But what happens to it from there becomes a political decision, because you can take the information and say, look, this proves my point. And then somebody else will take the same data and say, no, it proves my point. I mean, the joke used to be that if you put 5 economists in a room, you got 5 different opinions, 6 if one's from Harvard. So it's almost impossible to separate out the politics, because economics becomes the tool. Back when I used to teach statistics, I used a book that was written in the 1950s called How to Lie with Statistics. And basically it was a primer on how you could manipulate statistics. And I used to point out to the students, I said, if you're of a nefarious mind, you can prove anything to anybody by manipulating these numbers. If you're not of a nefarious mind, you at least know when you were being lied to, and that you can question the data and say, you say X, well, based on what? Like, for example, the Germans predicting what they were going to get in the way of power from wind. And they did all the numbers and it looked great. And it's like, we don't need the Russians anymore. We're going to do it all with wind power. Nobody factored in the years when the wind doesn't blow. And this was the year the wind didn't blow. So they got 20% of what they normally get from wind. And now they're in trouble. So there's always that political element. And I just warn people to look at the raw data and sort of come to your own conclusions in terms of what you think that means. I mean, particularly when you get into alternate energy and can we go electric, and what does that mean, and how many electric cars are there going to be, and do we have the capacity? There's a lot of different issues, and you have to give weight to them. It's like, maybe it is more expensive to use electric. Does that justify backing away from it, or are we also figuring in the impact on climate change? It's kind of like the US bemoans the fact that we don't produce our own rare earths. We have more rare earth metals than anybody on the planet. We just don't want to strip mine the entire state of Montana to get it. And so we buy it from China, because China's like, we don't care. There's nothing but Uyghurs out there, so we'll strip mine it and take it and sell it.
That's fair. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned during part of the presentation about certain commodities and the supply and demand behavior starting to at least stabilize and return to normal levels. Can you talk any more specifically about the microchip shortages? And because for us, that our whole industry revolves around that specific device, and
Yeah.
so our outlooks appear to be a little bit more bleak than
Yep.
for standard commodities that other people are referring to.
Absolutely. Theoretically, Taiwan Semiconductor has indicated that they are back to full production and we're in a position to meet demand. The US is in a bit of a difficult position because we made the national security decision not to buy the chips from China, which we used to. So we no longer buy from the Chinese companies, which eliminated a pretty good size supplier. Taiwan Semiconductor is trying to make up the difference. Down the road, the US is now actively encouraging the development of chip production in the US. There's a new one going up in Arizona, there's one going up in Ohio, there's one going up in upstate New York, but it's not like it's going to be ready next Thursday. I mean, it's going to be a year or two before this comes online. And the companies that are doing the chip production are kind of doing what a lot of the reshoring companies are doing. They're saying, look, we can make this here, and we used to make this here. But then you, the buyer, decided that you were going to buy it more cheaply from somewhere else. So you bought it from Taiwan, or you bought it from China, or you bought it from somebody else, and we were priced out of the market. And now you want us to come back into the market, and we're like, yeah, well, we've been down that road. If you tell us that you are going to buy from us and not abandon us another year down the road, we'll think about it. I was just in a very, not a semiconductor connection. There's a guy out in western Kansas that manufactures storage tanks for agriculture, and he couldn't get valves. He'd outsourced his valves to China. And now they're stuck on a ship and he can't finish the project. And so he's 92 years old, by the way. So a testament to an extended work career. So he gets up in front of everybody and says, I'm here to tell you right now today, if we don't make the product in Garden City, Kansas, I ain't using it. And 3 guys shot their hands up and said, we can make your valves. I can supply those by tomorrow. But you have got to promise me that you are not going to ditch me in 6 months. Because if I gear up to do this production and then you say, oh, well, I can get it from China again, we're going to have an issue. And he said, I promise you, I will sign a contract right here where I sit that I will buy from you for 10 years, 20 years, you tell me. And that's the negotiation going on now. A lot of manufacturers are saying, look, we can make anything. Our machines can make anything. That's not the point. The point is, are you going to dump me at the first opportunity after I bought the machine, trained the people, done what I have to produce? So there's going to be a lot of that kind of negotiation. And it just depends if the company is really have had it with supply chain problems and said, look, it's worth a little extra money to be able to actually get this instead of sit there for months unable to produce because I don't have the chips. You're having trouble. You can imagine what the auto industry is feeling right now. I mean, they're like, holy cow. I talked to a car dealer the other day. He sold 900 cars that he cannot deliver. People are paying for these cars. They've been paying for them for months, making payments on a car they don't have and won't have until sometime this summer. I mean, that's amazing.
Yep, that is. I just bought a car. It was used, and the car lot that I was at had 2 new cars on the lot. That was it.
Yep.
That's all they could get their hands on, and they
Yep.
were already sold. They just hadn't been picked up yet.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like,
insane.
I had a friend that needed a specific kind of work truck and was told they found one in Utica, New York. And he says, when can I have it delivered? And they just laughed and said, son, we ain't delivering nothing. You can fly to Utica and drive it home.
Yeah, I believe it. I believe it. Chuck, go ahead.
Chris, you've never made economics so much fun for an audience, I think, myself included especially. Could you speak to the U.S. Labor productivity rate?
Yeah, the labor productivity rate was pretty good until the wages started rising. And now it's beginning to show some stress, which is typical. You know, the wages go up, productivity doesn't catch up right away. The estimate is that we will probably get back to a decent productivity number by the end of the year. Most of the new hiring is sort of focused on need. You don't have a lot of companies that are hiring in anticipation. You know, they've got a position, they are, you know, desperate to put somebody in. And when you look at most recruiting right now, there's very little recruiting of somebody who doesn't have skills. What they're doing is poaching each other. So you're getting a new worker who's ready to roll immediately because you literally hired them away from your competitor. Where you end up with productivity losses is when you hire Skippy and it's like, okay, Skippy fogged the mirror and we need somebody in that position, but it's going to take us 12 to 24 months to get Skippy to the point that he knows where the bathroom is. And during that period, we're going to have serious productivity issues. One of the ways that we've measured overall productivity is capacity utilization. The capacity utilization numbers are still a little shy of what we would consider normal. You want to be in that 80 to 85% range. Right now, they're sitting at about 77, 76. So it's fairly close to what would be considered normal when it comes to utilization. Part of the reason that it has not gotten into that 80 zone is a lot of the machine acquisition is fairly new and the machines haven't been integrated yet. I talked to the machine tool makers and they said from the moment that you buy one of these things to the point that it's productive is probably about 6 months because you've got to be trained on it. You've got to make sure that your people know how to operate it and you integrate it into your system. That takes about 6 months. Then all of a sudden your productivity jumps.
Thanks, Chris.
Since anybody else have any questions?
I do have a question. I don't know if you're going to answer it or not, though. We do our raise cycle in April, and you keep on talking about the inflation and this inching up of the price. It's so true. The prices go up, the raises go up, and
Right.
it's game. So I don't know, but if I don't give decent raises, then my employees get poached.
Right.
I feel like utterly, completely stuck on what to do in
You're not
April. It's just like
alone.
I feel like I'm not going to win.
Yeah, you're not alone because you've got an awful lot of companies that are sort of facing that dilemma now. I mean, they can expect at some point that they will see a bit of a decline in those wage demands, but it's not going to be automatic. And meanwhile, you've got workers who are like, pay me or I'm gone. And if you're trying to poach other people's workers, you got to pay them more. And if you're trying to protect your own staff, the argument that you can try to use, and it's a little complicated for workers, but one of the things that happens down the road is that companies eventually have to get their labor costs under control. And one of the ways that they do that later is they start looking at their older, more higher paid employees and say, I'm sorry, time to go. You're the higher paid people in this office and I can hire a newbie at half what I pay you and see ya. So people who have to be a little aware of the fact that if you get paid a lot of money, you're also vulnerable. You're also going to be the first one to be cut. Somebody has put it in the sports analogy saying, you know, you were an all-pro last year, but dude, you're 35. And we just drafted a kid that's just as fast and just as shifty, and he's 22. Good luck out there with free agency. And that's almost the conversation. The only solution that I've seen anybody use is to try to load up with benefits and trying to convince people that it's not everything is wages. So good luck on that. The number one reason that people end up leaving a work environment is not even the bosses they work with, but the people they work with. So if they like the people they work with, it's sticky. If they don't really like the people they work with, they're looking for a chance to bolt. So tell your employees to be nice to one another. You know, bring them birthday gifts. And it's like, come on, you don't want to leave these people.
Yeah, for sure. Chris, I was curious. Go ahead, Tom. Go ahead.
I was wondering, you know, a lot of people are saying, I want to work from home now forever. what are you seeing in companies accepting that fact?
You know, it depends a lot on the work that's being done. If it's something that you can easily manage by output. It was kind of funny when all of this work at home stuff started and people were talking about, you know, nobody's going to do this, blah, blah, blah. I've worked from home for 23 years. It's kind of like we're an outsourced consulting solution. I'm an outsourced economist. No, most of my clients have never actually met me. You know, they don't need to. You know, it's they say, I need this, send it to me by next Tuesday. Fine, here you go. And that's the end of it. If you're in a position where that is possible and you can just literally do what you're asked to do and leave it at that, you may be able to work remotely forever. The people who are chafing at the remote opportunity are people who have to interact. They either have to sell or market or something. And the only other group that's not happy are the supervisors who are trying to figure out how to supervise people that they don't see. And what used to happen is you kind of wandered around the office and you could tell what people were doing or not doing. Now you have to wait until they actually present you with the work. And if there's something wrong with it, you don't have a whole lot of time to correct it. And so there's pushback on the part of supervisors. The estimate is that by the end of this year, they'll probably still be around 30% working from home, and the other 70% will be back either full-time in the office or at least hybrid. But it's going to be even different from one place to the next. Like Chicago, I was talking to the Iowa Department of Economic Development. They now consider Des Moines a suburb of Chicago because there are so many people working for Chicago firms from Des Moines, and they're working remotely. And this is, well, why is that? What they could buy in Chicago versus what they can buy in Des Moines. And talked to one guy that sold his $2 million shotgun building where you could reach out and touch your neighbor. $2 million he sold that for. You have any idea what you can get for $2 million in Des Moines? So it's that playing a role too.
Yeah, that makes sense. And manufacturing, right? We all have to get creative with flexible work schedules in manufacturing. Right. We have to be here to build product, but everybody's expecting that flexibility.
It's very hard to work from home when you're in manufacturing. People just, when you try to move the laser cutter to your garage, people just are like, no.
Frowned upon, yeah. Insurance guys frown upon.
Yeah, exactly.
Quick question regarding debt. So on two fronts, I know that when stimulus started happening, people started paying off debt kind of in record numbers, but then also the student loan debt situation where all that stuff is still on hold until later this year. How does all that play into what's going on?
Yeah, it's intensely controversial for the most obvious of reasons. I mean, when you look at the student loan situation, you have a lot of people, many of the people that I know saying, whoa, I paid my student debt and it wasn't easy. Why are they getting a free pass when I didn't? Then you start looking at some of the decisions, you know, those people that got the advanced degree in film criticism, I don't want to pay for their loan. It's like, if you're stupid enough to figure out that that's going to be how you're going to make your living, well, that's your problem. The debt situation, you've hit it on the nose, because it's personal debt, it's corporate debt, and it's government debt, and they're all very high. The debt level, the federal level, if it makes you feel any better, ours is 120%, 110% of GDP, depending on how you figure it. China is 280% of GDP. Japan's 260%. Greece is 180%. Among the nations in the world, we are among the most fiscally responsible, which is sad to say. And kudos to our Australian representative. The most fiscally responsible country in the world is Australia. You've got one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the world. So congratulations. The problem with the debt is different if you're Greece or if you're the US. Greece gets into trouble because their debt's so high that they can't sell their bonds. The yields are ridiculous. We don't have that issue because the T-bill is a coveted investment tool and there's always a market for it. Our problem is debt service, that we're forking out $400 billion a year in debt service. That same problem is affecting consumers and businesses where they're carrying high debt loads and they are very vulnerable, not as vulnerable as they've been in the past. If you go back to 2008, when everything collapsed, the average consumer had 72 hours of float. They could pay for 3 days before they had to get another job. We're much better now. We have 2 weeks. But still, that's not particularly secure. And even though a lot of people tried to pay off some of their debt with the stimulus money, most did not. Most just spent it and had a good time accumulating things during that period. So debt is not a problem until you have to pay it back. And then all of a sudden it becomes an issue. And the solutions are never easy. I mean, it basically means spend less or earn more. If you're a government, it's cut spending or raise revenue. Doing either one of those things makes you an ex-politician really fast.
Yeah, that's true. Anybody else have any questions, comments?
And by the way, if you have questions later, my email is at the bottom of all this, and the flagship is what we combined the business intelligence brief and the Black Owl report into one thing, because my partner and I were both writing different things, but it was stupid, so we combined them. So if you want a free trial to that, it's 1 month. You can read it for 4 weeks, and if you have questions later, I can assure you I am just as long-winded in an email as I am in public.
Oh, that's great. Chris, today has been outstanding. Thank you for the insights and the information and the discussion. The Q&A at the end was certainly really valuable. I know we had a lot of good members on today, which speaks to the quality of the presentation today. Our next meeting is March 4th, so we do have a few weeks before our next meeting. It'll just be an open executive session. So look forward to seeing you all there. And outside of that, we'll give you guys 10 minutes of your week back. So thank you so much for joining us, and please thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again.
Thank you all so much for the invite. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jerry. It's good to see you.